Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest. The crisp winter air bit at my cheeks as I stood in the kitchen of our cozy city apartment, the scent of sage and butter mingling with the faint tang of red wine simmering on the stove. At 35, Lauren Matthews, had always found solace in these domestic rituals: cooking, hosting, creating a haven for my husband James and our small circle of friends. Tonight was no different, or so I thought. James, 37, had invited a few colleagues from his tech startup over for dinner, a casual gathering to celebrate the launch of their latest project. I'd spent the afternoon preparing, setting the table with our best linen, lighting tall candles that cast a golden glow across the room, and arranging a centerpiece of pine branches and crimson berries to match the season. The apartment hummed with warmth, a stark contrast to the icy streets outside, and I felt a quiet pride as I smoothed the skirt of my burgundy dress, the fabric soft against my skin. But beneath the surface, a faint unease stirred in my chest, a whisper I couldn't quite name. I heard James's laughter from the living room, a deep, infectious sound that always made my heart lift, followed by the chatter of his colleagues as they arrived. James was in his element, his sandy hair tousled from running his hands through it, his green eyes bright with excitement as he played the perfect host. "Lauren, you've outdone yourself," he said, wrapping an arm around my waist as he surveyed the table, his touch grounding me. I smiled, but my eyes darted to the door as the last guest arrived. Evan Carter, a new hire at the company, 32 years old, with a reputation for being effortlessly charismatic. He was tall, with jet black hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through you, his smile a little too sharp, a little too knowing. He carried a bottle of wine, his leather jacket slung over one shoulder, and as he handed me the bottle, his fingers brushed mine, lingering just a heartbeat too long. "Hope I'm not too late, Lauren," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I brushed off the discomfort, chalking it up to my imagination, and forced a smile. "Not at all, Evan. Come in, make yourself at home." My voice was bright, but my stomach knotted as I turned back to the kitchen, busying myself with the final touches of the meal. The evening unfolded with the easy rhythm of a familiar routine: laughter, clinking glasses, the rich aroma of roasted chicken filling the air. James was deep in conversation with his boss, Sarah, about the project's success, while I played the gracious host, refilling drinks and ensuring everyone felt welcome. But Evan's presence was a shadow I couldn't shake. He sat across from me, his gray eyes catching mine every so often, a smirk playing on his lips as he made small talk that felt anything but small. "You've got a real talent for this, Lauren," he said, his voice low, almost intimate as I passed him the breadbasket. "James is a lucky man." The compliment was innocent enough, but the way he said it, his tone heavy, his gaze unwavering, made my skin prickle with unease. I laughed it off, my fingers tightening around the basket. "I like to think I'm the lucky one," I said lightly, hoping to steer the conversation away. But Evan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent an unwanted chill through me. "If I were him, I'd never let you out of my sight." The words were a quiet blade, slicing through the warmth of the evening, and my stomach twisted, a cold dread creeping up my spine. I glanced at James, but he was engrossed in his conversation, oblivious to the shift in the air. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was the wine, maybe Evan was just overly friendly, but the unease lingered, a heavy weight in my chest. As the night wore on, Evan's behavior grew bolder. A touch on my arm as I cleared the plates, his fingers lingering too long, leaving a trail of heat I didn't want. A glance that felt too heavy, too intimate, as if he were peeling back layers I hadn't offered. A quiet remark whispered just close enough to my ear to make my breath catch. "You look stunning in that dress, Lauren. It's a shame James doesn't notice." Each moment was a thread, weaving a tapestry of discomfort that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. By the time dessert was served, a warm apple tart I'd baked that afternoon, I felt trapped. My smile a brittle mask as I avoided Evan's gaze, my hands trembling slightly as I poured coffee. When the evening finally ended, James walked the last of the guests to the door. his laughter echoing down the hall. I busied myself in the kitchen, scraping plates with a ferocity I didn't feel, when Evan's voice cut through the silence. "It was nice spending time with you tonight, Lauren," he said, his tone low, his expression unreadable as he lingered in the doorway. "I hope we can do this again, maybe just the two of us sometime." The words hit me like a punch, stealing the air from my lungs. My heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against my ribs, as I stared at him, searching for a sign that I'd misheard. But the smirk on his lips, the glint in his gray eyes told me I hadn't. Before I could respond, James returned, clapping Evan on the back with a grin. "Glad you could make it, man. Drive safe." Evan's gaze flickered to me for a fleeting second, a silent promise that made my blood run cold before he turned and left. I stood frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, the sound of the door closing echoing in my ears like a gunshot. James's voice broke through my haze, light and unaware. "That went well, don't you think? Everyone seemed to have a good time." I forced a smile, my throat tight with unshed tears. "Yeah, it was a good night," I lied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Evan's words, his touch, his gaze, clung to me like a shadow, a dark stain I couldn't wash away. Something had shifted, something had changed, and deep down I knew this wasn't over. The next morning I woke with a heaviness in my chest, the apartment quiet except for the distant hum of James in the kitchen, brewing his usual Saturday coffee. I told myself I was overthinking it, that Evan was just being his overly charming self. But no matter how many times I tried to dismiss it, the memory of his voice, the way his fingers had lingered on mine, haunted me. I pushed the thoughts aside, wrapping myself in my robe before heading downstairs. "Morning, love," James said with a smile, handing me a steaming mug, his warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread in my chest. "Sleep okay?" "Yeah," I lied, taking a sip, the bitter taste doing little to calm my nerves. He didn't notice my hesitation, already moving on to his next thought. "Oh, by the way, Evan texted me this morning. He said he had a great time last night and wants to get together again soon." I nearly choked on my coffee, my hands trembling as I set the mug down. James didn't seem to notice, his voice casual. "I told him we should do a double date. Maybe dinner at that new Italian place downtown." I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming to say no, to come up with an excuse, any reason to avoid being in the same room with Evan again. But what was I supposed to do? Tell my husband that his colleague had crossed a line? That I wasn't sure what his intentions were, but they made me feel like a trapped animal? I didn't even have proof. Just a feeling, a gnawing dread that wouldn't let go. So instead, I forced a smile, my voice tight. "That sounds nice." James grinned, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Great, I'll set it up." Nah, the following week, I tried to forget about the whole thing, throwing myself into errands, catching up with friends, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to Evan. But then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a text. Evan. "Hey Lauren, hope you're having a great day. Can't stop thinking about our conversation the other night." My stomach twisted, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck as I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could have ignored it, should have ignored it, but part of me wanted to make it clear that whatever he thought was happening wasn't me. "Hey, Evan, I think you might have misunderstood something. I'm happily married, and I'd appreciate it if you kept things professional." I hit send, letting out a shaky breath, hoping that would be the end of it. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again. Evan. "Of course, Lauren, I respect that. Just saying if things were different." I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding as I read the words, the audacity of his response igniting a spark of anger beneath my fear. I didn't reply, but the message lingered, a dark cloud over my days. The double date happened 2 days later, and I considered canceling, coming up with some excuse, but I didn't want to raise suspicion. So I went, wearing a simple navy dress and my best attempt at a relaxed expression, though my hands trembled as I applied my lipstick. Evan and his wife Clara were already seated when we arrived at the restaurant, a dimly lit Italian place with soft music and the scent of garlic bread in the air. Clara was a petite woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, the kind of person who looked at her husband like he was her entire world. It made my stomach churn knowing what I knew, seeing the way she trusted him. Evan was as smooth as ever, making jokes, keeping the conversation lively, acting as if nothing had ever happened. But I caught it, the quick glances when no one was looking, the way his knee brushed mine under the table, the way he leaned in just a little too close when handing me the wine bottle. Each moment was a dagger, sharp and precise, and I felt trapped, my pulse racing as I tried to focus on Clara's small talk about her new job. And then, at one point in the evening, while James and Clara were laughing about a shared love for old movies, Evan murmured just low enough for only me to hear, "You're even more beautiful when you're nervous." I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears, my body tensing as I turned to look at him. He smirked, so subtle it was barely noticeable, but it was there, a silent challenge in his gray eyes. I had two choices: let it slide, pretend it didn't happen, like I had before, or stop this right now. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling under the table, and spoke, loud enough for James and Clara to hear. "Evan, I don't think it's appropriate for you to talk to me like that." Silence fell over the table, heavy and suffocating, the clatter of the restaurant fading into the background. James's head snapped up, his brow furrowing in confusion. Clara blinked, her smile faltering as she looked between us. Evan's smirk vanished, his eyes narrowing as he realized what I'd done. "What?" James asked, his voice sharp, his gaze darting from me to Evan. Evan let out a small, forced laugh, raising his hands in mock surrender. "It was just a joke, Lauren," he said, his tone light but laced with an edge of panic. "No need to make a scene." "It didn't feel like a joke," I said evenly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, my hands clenching into fists under the table. Clara's brow furrowed, her eyes searching Evan's face for an explanation, a flicker of doubt crossing her features. "Evan?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Evan shook his head quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a misunderstanding, babe," he said, his tone dismissive. "Let's not make this awkward." But it was already awkward, and I didn't care. I turned to James, my heart pounding as I met his gaze, letting him see the truth in my eyes. "I don't think I want to be here anymore," I admitted, my voice breaking slightly, the weight of the evening crashing down on me. James didn't ask any more questions. He nodded, his jaw tight, and stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Then let's go," he said, his voice firm, his hand reaching for mine. I grabbed my purse, gave Clara an apologetic look, her expression a mix of confusion and hurt, and walked out of the restaurant with James by my side, the cold night air a sharp relief against my flushed skin. The car ride home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as I stared out the window, my thoughts a tangled mess. James kept glancing at me, waiting for me to speak, but I couldn't find the words, my hands gripping my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. Finally, as we pulled into the parking garage of our building, he spoke, his voice low and gentle, but with a trace of something darker, concern, maybe even anger. "Lauren, what happened back there?" I exhaled, my breath shaky as I turned to him, choosing my words carefully, my voice trembling with the weight of what I was about to say. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding wrong," I admitted, my throat tight with emotion, my hands twisting in my lap. "Try me," he said, his voice soft but firm, his green eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. I swallowed hard, the words clawing at my throat as I spoke. "Evan has been making me uncomfortable," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That night after dinner at our place, he was too familiar, the way he touched my hand, the way he looked at me. I brushed it off as nothing, but then he texted me a few days later saying he couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. And tonight, he said something inappropriate to me. I tried to handle it on my own, but I realized if I kept quiet, it would never stop." James's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, his jaw clenching as a storm brewed in his eyes. "Lauren, Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked, his voice low and strained, a mix of hurt and fury lacing his words. Because I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, I admitted, my voice breaking as tears stung my eyes, my hands trembling in my lap. And because he's your colleague, I didn't want to make trouble for you at work. The confession spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, the weight of my silence pressing down on my chest. James shook his head, his eyes dark with a fury I rarely saw, his voice steady but laced with steel. You are my wife. You come first, always. Huh? His words were a lifeline, a quiet vow that made my chest tighten, and for the first time that night I felt like I could breathe. But this wasn't over. I could feel it in the air, a lingering threat that refused to dissipate. The next morning, I woke to find James already in the kitchen, his phone in his hand, his expression tense as he scrolled through messages. What's wrong? I asked, my voice thick with sleep, a cold dread creeping up my spine as I watched him. He let out a slow breath, his jaw tight. Evan texted me, he said, his voice clipped. He's trying to act like nothing happened. Said he hopes last night didn't cause any unnecessary drama. I scoffed, the words igniting a spark of anger beneath my fear. Unnecessary drama? Unbelievable! James looked at me, his eyes burning with determination. I don't want you to have to deal with this anymore, he said firmly. I'm going to talk to him at work, face to face. I hesitated, my heart racing as I searched his face. Are you sure? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of relief and apprehension. He crossed a line, James said, his voice unwavering, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. More than once. I need to make it clear that this is not okay. Something in his tone told me he wasn't going to let this go, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, a quiet strength in knowing I wasn't alone. That afternoon, while James was at work, I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that Evan wasn't the type to back down quietly. And I was right. Around 3:00 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text. Evan, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Can we talk, just the two of us? A chill ran down my spine, my hands trembling as I stared at the message, the audacity of his words igniting a fire in my chest. A few minutes later, another message. Evan, come on, Lauren, let's be adults about this. I gritted my teeth, my heart pounding as I blocked his number, the action a small rebellion against the fear that threatened to consume me. I called James immediately, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. When James came home that evening, he looked exhausted but determined, his jaw tight as he set his briefcase down. What happened? I asked, my voice trembling with anticipation, my hands twisting together in a nervous knot. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. I confronted him, he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of anger that made my chest tighten. At first, he tried to act like it was all a joke, that I was overreacting, but I made it clear. He is never to contact you again, ever. And if he so much as looks at you the wrong way, I'll make sure our boss knows exactly what kind of person he is. I bit my lip, my heart racing as I searched his face. And he just accepted that? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and dread. James's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. Not at first. He got defensive, said I was being ridiculous, that you were overreacting. But I told him I trusted you completely, and that was the end of the discussion. His words were a quiet vow, a promise that made my throat tighten with emotion, a rush of gratitude flooding through me. You really did that? I whispered, my voice breaking as tears welled in my eyes. Of course I did, he said softly, his voice steady as he stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine. Lauren, I will always stand up for you. You should never have to deal with something like this alone. His words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of my fear, and I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tight, the warmth of his embrace a quiet sanctuary in the storm of my emotions. Thank you, I murmured, my voice muffled against his chest, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Evan wasn't the type to back down easily, that this wasn't really over. And I was right. 2 days later, I was in the grocery store pushing my cart down the produce aisle, the fluorescent lights harsh against the bright colors of the fruits and vegetables. I felt it before I saw him, a presence, a shadow lingering just a little too close. I turned, and my stomach dropped. Evan stood a few feet away, casually inspecting a row of apples, his gray eyes flicking to me with a smirk that made my blood run cold. The store was across town from his office. He had no reason to be here. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck as I reached for a bag of oranges, trying to act like he wasn't there, my hands trembling as I gripped the plastic. "Lauren," he said smoothly, his voice a velvet blade as he stepped closer, his presence a dark cloud that threatened to suffocate me. "Fancy seeing you here." I didn't respond, my heart pounding as I focused on the oranges, willing myself to stay calm, to not let him see my fear. But he didn't take the hint. "No need to be rude," he continued, his tone light but laced with something darker, something dangerous. "I think there's been a little misunderstanding between us." I turned to face him, my heart thundering in my chest, my hands clenching into fists at my sides as I met his gaze, refusing to let him see my fear. "There's no misunderstanding, Evan," I said, my voice low and firm, though it trembled slightly with the effort. "You crossed a line, and you need to stay away from me." My words were a quiet rebellion, a stand against the fear that threatened to consume me, and I felt a spark of strength ignite within me, faint but undeniable. His smile faltered, his gray eyes darkening as the mask slipped, revealing the predator beneath. "Come on now, no need to be dramatic," he said, tilting his head, his voice a quiet threat that sent a chill down my spine. "Mark's a lucky guy. You should be careful, Lauren. A woman like you attract attention, not all of it good." The words were a warning, a subtle menace that made my blood run cold, and I felt a wave of panic crash over me, my hands shaking as I gripped the cart. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest, my eyes locked on his, searching for a crack in his facade. Evan held up his hands, that smirk returning, a silent challenge in his gaze. "Not at all," he said, his tone deceptively light. "Just making an observation." I turned and walked away, my hands trembling as I abandoned my cart, my steps quickening as I made my way to my car, locking the doors the second I got inside. My phone was already in my hand, my fingers shaking as I called James, my voice breaking as I told him what had happened. James came home earlier than usual that evening, his face a storm of fury as he stepped into the apartment, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a rage I'd never seen before. "He followed you?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling as I wrapped my arms around myself, the memory of Evan's words, his presence, sending a shiver through me. And he wasn't just being creepy, James. He was trying to scare me. My words were a quiet confession, the fear I'd been holding back, spilling out, raw and unfiltered. James exhaled sharply, pacing the kitchen, his movements sharp and restless. "That's it," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a quiet fury lacing every word. "I'm done playing nice." He met my eyes, his gaze burning with determination. "I'm going to our boss, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to HR. Evan doesn't get to do this, not to you, not to anyone." I swallowed hard, my heart racing as I searched his face, a mix of relief and apprehension flooding through me. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of my fear, my hands twisting together in a nervous knot. "I'm going to make sure he's held accountable," James said, his voice steady, his hands unclenching as he stepped closer, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of my emotions. "And I'm going to make sure he never comes near you again." His words were a promise, a vow that made my throat tighten with emotion, a rush of gratitude flooding through me. The next day, James filed a formal complaint with HR, detailing every incident, every text, every moment of discomfort. But before HR could act, Evan escalated things further. That evening, as I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book, My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, my heart racing as I answered, my voice trembling. "Hello?" "Lauren." Evan's voice purred through the line, smooth and menacing, sending a chill down my spine. "I heard James went to HR. That wasn't very nice of you." My blood ran cold, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone, my pulse thundering in my ears. "You need to stop this, Evan," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "Leave me alone." He laughed, a low, chilling sound that made my stomach twist. "I don't think you understand, Lauren," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I always get what I want." The line went dead, leaving me frozen, my hands shaking as I dropped the phone, a wave of panic crashing over me. I called James immediately, my voice breaking as I told him what had happened, the fear I'd been holding back spilling out in a rush. James was livid, his face a mask of fury as he called HR again, demanding immediate action. The next day, he insisted on working from home, refusing to leave me alone until the situation was resolved. Clara, Evan's wife, called me that afternoon, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and pain. "Lauren, I heard what's been happening," she said, her words halting, her breath shaky. "I had no idea Evan was doing this to you. I'm so sorry. I feel so betrayed." Her voice broke, a quiet sob escaping her lips, and I felt a pang of sympathy, a shared pain that made my chest ache. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Clara," I said softly, my voice trembling with emotion, my hands twisting in my lap. "I didn't want to hurt you. I just couldn't stay silent anymore." My words were a quiet confession, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me, a mix of guilt and relief flooding through me. "I'm leaving him," Clara said, her voice steadying, a quiet strength emerging beneath her pain. "I can't stay with someone who would do this. To you, to me, to our marriage." Her words were a quiet rebellion, a stand against the betrayal she'd endured, and I felt a swell of admiration for her, a shared strength that made me feel less alone. By the end of the week, Evan had resigned from the company, the pressure from HR and the threat of further action too much for him to handle. Word spread quickly, something about personal reasons and new opportunities elsewhere. But James and I knew the truth. He was gone, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe again, the weight of his presence lifting like a storm cloud dissipating in the morning sun. That weekend, James and I sat on the couch, a blanket draped over our laps, the city skyline glittering through the window as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson. "You okay?" he asked, his fingers lacing through mine, his touch a quiet comfort that grounded me. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips as I met his gaze, the warmth in his green eyes a quiet sanctuary. "Yeah," I said softly, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I think I finally am." James exhaled, rubbing his thumb over my hand, his touch a quiet promise. "I should have seen it sooner," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have—" I cut him off, my hand tightening around his, my voice firm. "No," I said, my eyes searching his with a quiet intensity. "He was the problem, not you, and you stood by me when I needed you most. That's what matters." My words were a quiet vow, a promise that made my chest ache with gratitude, a rush of love flooding through me. James pulled me closer, pressing a kiss to my forehead, his lips warm against my skin. "Always," he murmured, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm of my emotions. I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder, the warmth of his embrace a quiet sanctuary. This whole ordeal had been a nightmare, a dark shadow that had threatened to unravel everything I held dear. But in the end, it had taught me something important. About myself, about James, about the strength we had together. Evan had tried to break me, to make me feel powerless, but all he had done was remind me just how strong I truly was.